Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Passing into the Future, the official PASS podcast that connects students to resources and advice on school, the workforce, and life. We're your co-hosts, Io.
I'm Nyla.
And today we're here with Haley Dawson to discuss her journey as a legal psych PhD student and also to talk about, some advice for undergrad RAs to get, a little inside scoop on how does the research process work and how can they, become like you.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, we're glad for you to be here. So Haley Dawson is a legal psychology PhD student working under the mentorship of Dr. Dawn Fisher and conducting research in the Investigative Interviewing Lab, or iLab, and her interests include investigative interviewing and eyewitness memory.
You mentioned that I worked with Ron Fisher, which I did for my master's thesis, but my PhD dissertation is with Dr. Nadja Schreiber-Campo. So I did just want to quickly say that.
Oh, thank you for that.
Yes, and she is the PI of the iLab.
So we wanted to start with your education, right? So you began as a biology and psychology double major with a minor in gerontology, if I'm saying that right, at U of M. And then we saw on the U of M Victors in Grad School podcast, you kind of discuss a change in trajectory from medical school to a PhD in legal psychology. I wanted to know if you could tell us more about that process and why it was that you decided to make that change. I think that was something that interested me personally because I am on the pre-med path. So I've definitely have had that moment of like, do I want to do my MD or do I want to do a PhD?
Mm-hmm.
And it's kind of weighing those on a scale. So I would love to hear your journey and weighing those pros and cons and how you came to the choice that you came to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I was basically planning to apply to med school for like my whole life, wanting to be a doctor of some sort. Learned about gerontology, which is basically like an old people doctor, for lack of a better phrasing for it, but basically working with elderly patients. Hence the minor. And so that was kind of my planned path. And then my very last semester of undergrad, actually, we got like a new faculty who was doing research in legal psychology. And I knew that having that kind of like extracurricular would be really important for like med school applications because I didn't have any research. It wasn't very big at my undergrad university. So I went to a smaller, so I didn't go to like U of M Ann Arbor. I went to U of M Flint, which is a little bit smaller of a school. It's like a sister school. And we just didn't like, we really focused on like classes, not necessarily research. So most of our faculty weren't really involved in research. And so I already had like added psych as a double major. And so I said, hey, I could do psych research. And I was interested, like never heard of legal psych, but I was like, I can probably figure that out. So I interviewed with him and got a position in the lab and it pretty much fell in love with it right away. It didn't really like raise any red flags at the time. I was like, oh, this is really fun, a great experience to have before I, decide to go to med school. And I already planned on like taking a gap year in between because I was taking a little bit longer to graduate undergrad because I added a double major a little bit late. So I took a little bit of extra time, like 5 years for undergrad. And then just kept working in the lab. I worked in a couple other research labs in undergrad. And it wasn't until I went to my first conference in legal psychology. So our lab was doing some really like fun getting research out into the world projects. And so we, in our like first year, went to our big like national conference in legal psychology. And it was only there when I was like, oh, I really love this. And so I really liked going to see like the new up and coming research, to just talk to people about the things that I was doing and the like interests that I had. And it just kind of all clicked from there. And I came back from the conference, it was in Memphis. And I was like, oh no, I need to figure out what I want to do with my life. And so I already kind of planned on taking some time in between. And so I just kind of sat down with my advisor and I said, okay, I don't know what I want to do with my life. And so we went to like a little cafe by our university and he was like, all right, let's make a list of what you want to do. Like, what do you want your future to look like? Not the job, but what do you want to have? Is family important? Is, what kind of salary? Where do you want to live? What are these things that are of interest to you? So those little lists were very helpful. And he was like, I think maybe you want to be a teacher. I'm like, no, I hate teaching. I don't want to be a teacher. I've never really taught in undergrad or anything. I did like some TA stuff and, did a little bit of like tutoring and things. So I was like, no, I don't want to do that. I hate teaching. And then come to find out in grad school, the first semester I taught, I loved it. And so he was right all along. And so that was kind of my, I don't know, I guess trajectory, long story short into that.
For sure. And what were some of those things that you saw yourself or that you wanted for yourself that the PhD sort of helped you get there?
Mm. Um, that's a good question. So I really was interested in having like my own like control over what I was doing, which sounds like a little bit silly because it doesn't really happen in like the medical field. Hence why maybe that's why I'm not in med school and I'm instead in a PhD program. But I really liked the idea of having like flexibility, the choice to like do the things that I was interested in doing. I always liked the research side, even like medical research is really interesting. And you can go to medical school and still like do medical research after that. Like that's an option. But I wanted to, have some flexibility at the time. I didn't have any like strong intentions on leaving my home state of Michigan. That has since changed a little bit. And so there's lots of opportunity for teaching there as well. So he was like, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of places you can go if you are, broadly interested in teaching. Also, you can teach with just like a master's degree. You can still get some pretty good positions there, but I was really interested in kind of like the research side. So I just kind of really fell in love with the topic of legal psychology when I was an RA and was like, yeah, I want to continue this.
Yeah. Perfect. And I don't know, I feel like I want to commend you for making that choice because I realized how hard it is to kind of let go of a vision that you had for yourself in the future and a dream that you had. And I kind of like that you were able to realize, that's not aligned with what I envisioned for my future, and that you were able to make that hard choice, because I think a lot of people, once they start down a path, they kind of have that like sunk cost fallacy that like, I've gotten this far, like I might as well see it through. But once you finish, like you're like, okay, well, now what? I'm still unhappy. So, I think that was a very good change that you made for yourself. I did want to go back a little bit. And so I remember when you were speaking of your time in labs as an RA, we kind of wanted to learn a little bit more about that, right? So we have spoken to grad students in the past who have mentioned that they might need to know particular skills, for example, either coding or working with SPSS. When that's not really something that's taught to us as undergrads. I was hoping if you can tell us some additional skills that we can start to encourage our undergrads to learn that they aren't commonly taught.
Yeah. So I would say like knowing how to do statistics going into graduate school is like helpful, but certainly not required. Pretty much every single graduate program is going to have, if like statistics is part of it, they already have a course plan for you. You don't have to like learn that on your own. They're going to teach you. That's, at the end of the day, a PhD is still a training position. You are training how to be a researcher. You're learning the field. You're trying to understand what is currently happening, what is going to happen in that field in the future, and how you can contribute to that body of research, in the best way, hopefully, that you can. So I think it's not quite, at least for psychology, it's obviously depends on what other areas you're interested in, like some of those tangential sister departments of psychology. But I would say generally for psychology, you don't need to have all of this like extensive background. Obviously, the more you can do, the better. But I wouldn't limit yourself to like, I have to get this top position in a research lab. I can only be like a lab manager and have these like tick boxes for you. Really, any research is good research. So even things like public health research is really relevant. I worked with some medical research, just giving out surveys in the medical in an OBGYN ward, which is literally, I do that as a graduate student. I give surveys to people. So you're still obtaining those skills. So it's more so thinking about like transferable skills. And I kind of like you mentioned too, of like, you kind of had that sunken cost fallacy. I did all of this stuff. Like, how does this now reflect into what I want, what I'm planning on going into? And again, you have to just think about those transferable skills. Pretty much anything that you do, any kind of volunteering that you do, or work that you have has skills that you are obtaining that can make you ideally successful in whatever you choose for kind of your next step. So a lab doesn't necessarily have to like give you absolutely everything. I think graduate committees are often, or admissions committees are just often looking for people who are really passionate about what they're doing. They have some semblance of a plan. They understand what that degree means. So in legal psychology, that's pretty common for people to not really get it, like get what we do. So I'm not gonna go be like a police officer and kick down doors like in Criminal Minds and take down the bad guy. That's not what legal psychology research is at all. But I'm also not going to be, like assessing mentally ill patients on the stand either. We don't do any of that. So I think having a really good understanding of like the field that you're going into, like what people in that field are actually doing. I think that's kind of the important aspects there is what research can really give you to see, oh, so people in this field, this is how they live their everyday life. This is the opportunities they get. This is what their career paths look like. So in terms of getting skills in a variety of labs, it's really just trying to take advantage of those opportunities when they come along. So I would say kind of like to bring it all the way back around to the original question of skills that you should ideally be obtaining, I would really say being able to be independent. A graduate program, you're pretty much going to be on your own for developing study ideas, running those studies. Obviously you collaborate with others, but it's really, you have to be really independent and self-starting. So I think kind of learning how to do that is really important. Having really good writing skills, if you have that kind of opportunity, just knowing how to read research. That's another thing that is a learned skill. You're not just born knowing how to read a research article and take the important information. So that can be really helpful that you can get in a research lab. And most of the time I would say the people that you're working with are more than happy to provide some resources for you and have some discussions about articles, because we all have our favorite articles. So I'm more than confident that any lab would be happy to have those discussions. But I think other skills would really just be working really well with others, taking direction well. That's really important, being able to work as a team and collaborate, come up with your ideas, and really like show initiative. Sometimes those opportunities aren't always present. I would love if all of my RAs, I think I've had going on like 50 total RAs as a grad student in my time here. And I would love to be able to take every single one of them to a conference and present, and, but that's just not the reality of research. So I would love to give them those opportunities. So I would say trying to excel in those areas. And so when those opportunities do arise, your name, is kind of on that roster of potential, to go to a conference, to present research, to kind of have your own independent project. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answered the question or it was more information than needed.
No, 100%. That was great. And I love what you said about the transferable skills, because I feel like what a lot of students in particular don't realize is that you can apply like the skills that you learn in retail, where you learn how to deal with people, how to problem solve, that you can apply that in a lab, even though it's not necessarily a traditional experience that you would mention in a lab. It can definitely have value.
That is actually something that we spoke to Dr. Kenny, and that's something that she brought up, right, was the idea. I feel like sometimes we're taught clean up your resume, right? Your resume should be 100% tailored to the position you're applying to. And so, me specifically, when I was applying to be an RA, I took all of my retail experience off my resume because I'm thinking, what does this have to do with research? But then to hear, like you were saying, transferable skills, and that's again something that Dr. Kenny said, right? It's like, just because you don't have the experience specifically in research does not mean that you don't have skills that can be kind of brought over, like taking initiative, knowing how to be a team player. So many jobs are going to teach you that you can then like kind of transfer into research.
Yeah, absolutely. And not every research position is going to be the same either, right? So the vast majority, unfortunately, of like psychology research relies on basically volunteer RAs. Grad students don't even get paid that well, let alone being, I would love to be able to pay I'd love to be able to pay all my RAs, get them all the great experience that they need, but that's just, again, not the unfortunate reality that we live in. And so it is, at the end of the day, like volunteer time, and it's just knowing that putting that effort in is going to be really good. But it's not even, just about getting the skills either. It's also, making contacts for letters of recommendation or collaborations in the future, particularly if you want to go into the field of like research. It's a little bit different if you're interested more in like the therapy clinical side. They have some different requirements that I'm not fully well versed in, aside from some very surface level ideas. But it's more than just being able to develop skills, because you might be a really great research assistant, but if you're kind of, not very nice, or you're not very communicative, like, yeah, you get your work done and you've learned some things, but maybe you don't have a really great relationship with your grad student or that you're working with, or the PI on your project, that letter of recommendation probably isn't going to be as impactful as somebody who does all of those things, and is really personable and close with the lab. So I think there's kind of multifaceted that I always talk to my RAs about is, yes, you're getting skills here, but also a letter of recommendation, which in a lot of cases kind of make or break whether you get into grad school. Because everyone applying to grad schools is good, so it's kind of hard to stand out. Those letters of recommendation can really kind of float your resume to the top.
No, 100%. And I love that you mentioned that, because I think that was a lesson that I've had to learn while I was in school. I think I went into school being more reserved, more shy. And then I noticed like I didn't really make friends and I didn't make as many connections. So I found that the way that you present yourself to people and how open and expressive you are, like that really reflects in like the connections you make, in the abilities, because with the new friendships that you make, you are able to have connections. You can get opportunities that you wouldn't have otherwise had if like you would have just sat to yourself the whole time and like not talked to people.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Like some of my best stories are ones that have approached me in class that I've taught, and they've said like, "Hey, do you have any positions open?" And I'm like, "I do, actually." Those end up being some of the best people who like approach you yourself. So yeah, making those connections, and that's kind of hard when we're at like a larger university that has some big classes. It can be really tough, but I've definitely got those letter of recommendation requests as a teacher that I'm like, "Ooh, I don't really know you that well," and sometimes you have to decline it and say, "Hey, unfortunately I don't really know you well enough to give you a good recommendation." We know that those are really important, and so it's making those connections anywhere possible. And so especially bringing back up to like a research position is kind of being in that as long as you can, so getting involved early and staying for a long time.
So I actually wanted to stay on that a little bit longer. So I noticed that you mentioned that you had a lot of students that would ask you for letters. What do you think is, because I can see how it can be really intimidating to be able to build that connection with a professor or with a mentor. How would you recommend students to go about kind of like getting your name in the like, on their mind, getting your foot in the door, like without being too obnoxious or like obvious about it? I feel like yeah, if you have any tips on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's my perspective might be a little bit different as someone who's in grad school. So my teaching load is very light compared to professors that are teaching 5-6 classes a semester. And so I think I would definitely suggest, one, doing really well in the class. Obviously, you don't want to necessarily ask for a letter of recommendation from somebody that you like failed the class on or something like that. Like, unfortunately, they're not going to really speak on your behalf probably very well. And if that's your only option, that's not ideal. So definitely, I think doing well in the course and kind of thinking about what that professor wants you to get out of it and making sure that you're demonstrating that you got it. So like I've taught senior seminar, currently teaching senior seminar for psychology. And I hope that people have a really good understanding of reading research articles and having their own unique thoughts. And if I see students doing that, I can go on to say, hey, they developed really good critical reasoning and analysis skills in my class, and I saw that develop. Or if you are taking like a special topics course or something that's not very common, maybe one of the things your professor really wants you to do is have, come up with a unique idea for a research project, or, a policy implication of X, Y, or Z, and being able to really demonstrate that through like good writing. So that means going to the writing center, making sure that your writing looks really good, and that your professor, if they make comments, you make changes, or you maybe go to them and talk to them. Because aside from just the work that you do in the class, it's always really nice to get those emails for recommendation letters, and they're like the top performing student in the class. And I can say, so-and-so was the best student in my class of 50 students. Like, that's a really easy thing to talk about their academics. But if you don't have to be the top student to get a good letter of recommendation. Right. You can just be a really talkative student that I know you and can understand that you know the material. Maybe your writing isn't as strong, but maybe you improved over the class. So then I can go in and say, hey, this person did struggle. They took my recommendations. They sought help. They improved their writing. And by the end, they were doing really well in their papers. So it's really just demonstrating, I guess, any of those things for academics wise. And then just knowing the professor. So that means going to office hours. If they make feedback or make comments on your feedback, or if your professor makes comments and you respond to those comments. Or, talking to them before class, if they ask questions in class, raising your hand and talking. So I think it's sometimes it's as simple as that, and just engaging in the course. And so I don't always have a ton of advice for online classes, because I think that's really tough. Unless they have some like Zoom office hours or something. But I think it's just talking to them. And that can be kind of hard, right? Especially if you're a good student and you don't really have like necessarily, but we all have something that we could potentially improve on. Hey, I have a draft of this paper you wanted me to write. Do you think we could go over it? Hey, I'm getting ready to start this. Do you think we could maybe go over an outline or something? So there's always some way that you can hopefully kind of fit your conversations in there. But sometimes, again, it's as simple as going before or after class, or hey, you mentioned this in class. Have you thought about this? Have you seen this? I literally had a student come up to me last week and say, okay, you talked about this last week. Have you seen this movie that's related to that? We had, a 5-minute conversation about it. And I will sure remember that conversation come, end of the semester if she's applying to grad school. Like I will remember those things. So I think that's just getting yourself out there, which is really hard to do. So it's, give or take that.
Yeah, right. So I guess what I'm saying is like to kind of be more proactive and kind of just not expose yourself, but I feel like for people that aren't used to being that social, to take that first step and just,
Yeah. And it also sounds like what you're really saying is kind of to remember that your professors are people. And so
100%.
outside of, just talking about the classwork, like you bringing up, that a student came up to you to talk about a movie, that's something you said reminded them of. And that's something like I wouldn't even think to talk to a professor about. I feel like sometimes that's what makes the idea of speaking to a professor feel so daunting, is that, I guess the structure of the relationship where it's like, oh, I say the wrong thing, I don't want to,
I've definitely had those professors in undergrad that I'm like, I don't want to talk to you outside of class, and so you kind of have to, pick and choose wisely. Yeah. Like you don't want to go in and have like a motive by any means, but it, like for example, having a professor in multiple classes can be really helpful. And so, like I've had a couple students that I've had in 2 or 3 classes, which is really nice. I can talk a lot about them. I can go back and look at their grades. I have a lot more information about them than just somebody who I had on a, Tuesday, Thursday class 4 semesters ago that I didn't really talk to. So, it's just kind of thinking more strategically about some of those connections that you make. And sometimes you don't know. Maybe you think this professor is going to be really great and that you're going to be able to talk to them, and you end up not finding that to be true. That's okay. You just try again the next time. Or sometimes the professors that you think are really unapproachable, you just kind of take that shot and say like, hey, so I did have like an extra question, and maybe that opens the door. They say, hey, yeah, come stop to my office hours. Like people, the thing is, if you have anybody as your professor that does research, the number one thing they love talking about is their research. So that's always an easy in. Oh, so you teach this class, do you do research in it? Not all professors do, but I think that's always that's a really like easy in, and you got to also be genuine about it. Professors will pretty quickly see if you're not. So don't be like sneaky. Be nice and genuine about it.
Right. Going back to the research, and the labs, we had sort of a simple question for you, but I was hoping that you could help us address it. We were kind of wondering if you could break down for us the differences in expectations that a research assistant would have compared to like a PhD student, as it pertains like in the lab and the responsibilities. And if there was anything that surprised you in like the differences between the roles, since you have experienced both.
Yeah, great question. So I think it is going to fully depend on the kind of lab that you're working in. So I was really lucky that in my undergraduate experience, our advisor essentially treated us like grad students, which we didn't know. I didn't know that at the time, but that's what was happening. But then I got to grad school and I was like, I'm doing the same exact things that I did as an undergrad. So that was really nice. I would say most labs are not like that. That's not what the experience that you're getting most of the time. So if you can get those experiences where maybe you're doing an independent project or something, or if you're in the honors program and the honors, what is it called? Like the honors thesis. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So if you have that independent project you can work on or something like that, then you're going to get a little bit closer to that experience as a grad student. Because generally most RAs, right, are doing more like you're being directed by that work, like you're not starting it. So you are being trained in a protocol in order to run participants, or you're given a code book and you're going through and categorizing data and working with other people to do that, or you're transcribing videos or doing something. All those are really important and integral parts of the research process. We literally wouldn't be able to do any of our research without undergraduates helping us with that. So it's a very important part of it, but that's a very different experience than what you're going to be doing in grad school. So I would say kind of the levels there would be somebody who is, just starting out, you're getting your feet wet, maybe you're given a couple articles to read, you're getting trained in a protocol to run participants, maybe you have, some coding that you can do. And coding, by this I mean like the categorization, not like learning Python or C or anything like that. So coding in the sense of categorizing data, to prep it for data analysis. I think those are all great experiences. 100% should do them. It's, I would say, a explicit requirement for most graduate programs nowadays that you have to have some sort of research experience, whether regardless of how involved you are in that process. Having a something is going to make you much more competitive than having nothing. The kind of intermediate step to that, I would say, is like a lab manager. So not every lab has this. Not every. It's very, again, very dependent on the lab that you're in, but those kind of positions give you some more of that like organizational skills that are really important for grad school. So I essentially feel like a project manager when I'm a grad student in all of my different projects, but I am always the project manager. And so I don't get to delegate that out to anything. I'm always delegating, you know, coding to RAs. I'm running training. So there's a lot of that kind of involved in graduate school. So you can get a little bit of that as a lab manager. So maybe you onboard new RAs, or you do something as simple as schedule meetings and take meeting minutes and, you know, disseminate all that information to the RAs. It seems like that's really silly, but having some of those skills was really helpful as a grad student that I got only as an undergrad because I was a lab manager. Because you might think scheduling is easy. When you're trying to schedule for 15 people, it ends up being not as easy as you think. So I think even those little things, those little skills that you wouldn't initially think would be super relevant become really relevant there. And so kind of, you know, those lab manager positions tend to, again, you know, not everybody earns the right to have their own independent projects, but those positions tend to have people who are clearly showing some good promise as students. And so they might be offered, you know, hey, I'm looking for somebody to take lead on this project. Would you be interested in kind of taking those opportunities as they arise? And then some of the things that I don't think you really get as an undergrad RA in like the vast majority of cases are going to be like those self-starting projects. So you know, you watched a presentation and you came up with a research idea and you say, I want to do that research. And you go to your advisor and you talk it through, and you are the one that's doing all the background research, and you're reporting back to your advisor and coming up with the study design and doing grant applications. So that's all like more on the grad student level. That if you did that as an undergrad, fantastic. The vast majority of people aren't, and it doesn't make you competitive to like not have experience. Because again, graduate school is still a training program. You are still learning, and so it's okay to not know everything.
Mm-hmm.
Of course. Okay. Thank you. Like continuing on that vein, right? Of, you know, research assistant versus lab manager. We do know you were a lab manager under Dr. Peter Molinaro for about 2 years, after being a research assistant in his lab, right? So what do you think, I guess, sets you apart to kind of move up the ranks in the lab?
Oh, good question. I think there are just some people who are really natural born leaders. And I think I've always been one of those people. Like I was always heading the group projects and saying, all right, let's delegate this out. And, you know, if you aren't going to do your job, then fine, I'll do it, which is not the healthy thing to do. But, you know, we didn't talk about boundaries when I was a child. So that was a little bit more I guess like my personality. And so I think it was really just the like strong interest in the research. I was doing a lot of stuff like outside of the lab to make myself know more. So I was reading research articles. I was, you know, watching videos of really well-known people in the field, and like talking to my advisor about those. Like, hey, did you know this? And of course he did because he had a PhD, but I didn't know those. And so I was having those conversations and say like, oh, I like read this thing which connects to what we're doing, so I get it. And so I think it was really just showing that I was willing to put in more work and more effort than my kind of average person. And again, I don't think that that's necessarily a requirement for you know, that you have to like burn yourself out in order to become a lab manager by any means. And again, not all labs have them. And so you might be like, I don't want people to come out of this and say like, I have to like work so hard for the person that I'm working for, but then they don't have any kind of position or benefit to that anyways. Like you should work with the benefit that you're going to be given. But I think it's really showing that you have a passion for it, and also that you are extremely competent. And I think that's kind of a hard word to define because again, it just depends. But you know, if you're really communicative and you always, you know, for example, tell me if you're going to be late, or you take over shifts, so you're always, you know, very responsive and you do really well, you follow directions, like some of those really basic ideas and you just always do them well, you're very consistent. I think that's what I always kind of pick up on as a grad student who's like looking for those kind of project managers, to say like, oh, I think that would be a good person, and then talking to them about it. Because if I've definitely had people that I've said, hey, I think you'd be really great. Do you want to, be a project manager for this project? And they have too much on their plate. That's totally reasonable. If it's not really something that like behooves you for your future, not necessarily a requirement to have. Like, there's no like pay increase. There's not like a lot of extra benefit that you get other than the experience and the skills. So if it benefits you, great, definitely do those, but it's not necessarily for everybody. And obviously not everybody can become that.
Yeah, of course. As you said, it's not always available, and not everyone has, I guess, the necessary skills at the time, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I did want to also ask, as someone, you said you've worked with around 50 research assistants. What do you look for specifically in a legal psychology research assistant that maybe someone who's, in charge of a clinical lab might not be looking for?
So I really, I think currently am just looking to see if someone understands why they need research. And so I don't think I'm looking for anything like unique necessarily. Like I said, I don't think getting research experience is limited to the field that you're interested in. Again, maybe aside from clinical, like for example, if you really want to work with kids, probably really good if you get experience doing research with kids, but that's not a requirement by any means. Like that doesn't mean that you would be terrible. It would just be nice to have some experience with kids so that your, potentially future advisors know that you're not going to get into it and suddenly be like, I hate kids. you don't want that. You want to have something that shows that you have, done the research, giving yourself a little bit of that exposure, for whatever your future kind of looks like. And so I don't think I in particular am looking for anything. I don't think GPA is a particularly good predictor. However, I do want to ensure that the people I'm bringing on have at least a competitive GPA for the programs they're interested in. And so if somebody comes to me and they have a 2.0 GPA, but they're like, I'm going to go get a PhD in clinical psychology, which are the most competitive PhD programs in the psychology field, I would say, well, let's maybe like think about some other options, because then the research doesn't necessarily benefit them. There's not really a good explanation on why they maybe have a very low GPA and are not super competitive. So, you want to make sure you're kind of boosting the people who are more likely to kind of get in that position. But I also don't really feel like GPA has been a very good predictor of good or bad RAs either. So I think my experience has pretty much shown that it's very individual and there's not a lot of consistency or commonalities of people who are really good RAs versus who only stay in the lab for a month or a semester and then decide to leave, because it's about getting that experience, right? And so I think just the kind of enthusiasm or interest is really what I kind of look for, and that they understand why they're trying to get research experience. So if their reason is like, oh, because I know I need research to get into grad school, great, that like checks that box. But if they're like, oh, I know, I just wanted to try something new, I might be like, okay, but why this? Why research? And if they say, oh, because I want to be like someone on Criminal Minds, and I will say, you do not understand what we do as researchers, and we'll have a little conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, Spencer Reed is not really based in real life.
Right. He's
yeah, not in our program.
Right.
Okay, that's definitely understandable. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is, of course, that why is really important, that they not only understand why, like you said, why are you here, but also where can you go from here, right? Like you said, with the 2.0 GPA, you might not be able to get into clinical. It is one of the most competitive, and it's very difficult to get into. So I know you said it is very individualized, and like the enthusiasm is what kind of drives research assistants to succeed. But are there any I don't know, any predictors or any like hunches based on like your experience interviewing RAs? Is there anything that might be some random thing like, oh, they wore a blue shirt and people with blue shirt?
If that was the case, I'd probably try to design a study of it. So for legal psychology, I'll pitch that we have a application, like a Qualtrics application, basically that just asks who you are, why do you want to be in a lab, whose lab's research is most interested to you, kind of when can you work, are you a remote person, can you work in person? So we do have that. I'll happy to share the link for whenever you post this.
Oh, don't worry.
But we yes, but we're always there's 10 to 15 of us grad students at any given time. And so we're almost always looking for RAs at some point or another. So it's kind of a communal use. And so any person that I have reached out to that emails me back, I pretty much have accepted into the lab. So I think if you're kind of my perspectives, if you're already going to the trouble of filling out an interview application, and I don't get any like real bad vibe. I've never gotten like a bad vibe in an interview. So I guess unless you give me some really bad vibes or like really dismissive or very, I wouldn't even say like necessarily unprofessional, because that's always a hard definition to make. But as long as you like show up on time and you are interested, you give me some decent answers, I'm probably gonna bring you on as an RA. So it's I don't think I've ever said no to anybody. So I think it's just giving people the chance. And if they decide that they don't like it, then that's totally fine. It's not my job to like make a researcher out of every RA. I had a student who was in my class and was interested in being an RA, said, absolutely, like, let's talk about it. It seemed great. And they, about a semester in, were like, hey, so I don't like research and I don't think I'm going to continue. And I'm like, that's totally fine. And they were like, you gave me great experience. It's nothing to do with you. I just don't like this. And I'm like, that's fine, because originally you wanted to go to grad school for research. So that's really valuable knowledge. I don't want people to sit there and like hate their time. That's not fun for anybody.
Yeah.
And so it's, I unfortunately don't have any good predictors aside from seeking out those opportunities, because you never know what will happen.
Yeah. And I love you bringing that up, right? Because I feel like the theme of what you've kind of been saying is to diversify those experiences, because a lot of skills are transferable. And, for instance, if they had never gotten into a lab, they would have never known that they needed to pivot,
Yes. Yeah. And like, just say that they did get into a grad program, maybe they had other great experiences, and then they're like, oh, I moved across the country for something I hate. And now do I stay here? Do I push through? Do I leave? And that's a very expensive mistake to make. So.
Yeah, that's costly time and financial, because now you have to move back home and figure it out. Thank you for that. You also, I think, hinted at that sometimes you're the one who's reaching out to potential RAs. So can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, what would be the scenario in which you would be the one reaching out to a student like, hey, come on, join the lab?
Yeah, so I think this is similar to like the letter of recommendation conversation. So any student that really, so let me backtrack briefly. So in my class, when I'm teaching, I have like an introduction assignment that's just like, let me learn about you a little bit. And so I kind of like note to those people that are interested in some sort of PhD program in psychology. And, if they do well in the course, whether it be their writing really strikes me or they're providing really good conversations in class, they're really responsive, they maybe have some really unique ideas in their papers or submissions, then I used to do it at the end of every class, but I haven't now because I don't really need a lot of RAs right now. But I used to, at the end of every class, they reach out to like the top like 5 or 6 people, depending on the size of the class, that I, kind of went through their grades and past experiences. And I kind of like note stuff in my own comments. And I would just say like, hey, we have a legal psychology application to be an RA. If you're interested, here's the link. This is why it's important to have if you want to go to grad school. You mentioned you're interested in clinical psych, so it's good to have any research experience, or you mentioned you really want to go be a legal psychologist. Here's a great way to get this opportunity. And so if they apply, great. If they don't, it was a copy and paste email to all of the good students, so it's not like the worst thing, but it's still meaningful. I still personalize it to all of them. Still means the same thing. So that's usually the situation where I will reach out, is if I've had them in class or if I have been a TA. So I don't just teach my own classes, I've TA'd before as well. So if there's any students that particularly like stand out for, again, it could just be that they had a lot of conversations with me throughout the class. I'm like, hey, you seem competent. Would you like to be an RA? And, it's a yes or no. So I've been semi lucky with those, I suppose. But then when people apply to our application, because there's a group of us looking at it, we are always the ones to like then reach out and say like, hello, we got your application. So that would be the other situation. I guess also if someone works in my lab already and they say, hey, I have a friend that's interested, I might then reach out. So I've gotten a couple of RAs that way. So again, sometimes it's all about who you know. So yeah, I think that's mostly the situations when I would reach out to somebody. If for, X, Y, or Z reason, I was like, oh, they I think they would be a good RA.
So I feel like I love to hear that, you know, you're still taking that time to like open those doors for people and reach out. I think that's a great effort. And I wanted to point that out. So
yeah, I mean, as an undergrad, I was like a first gen student. My parents didn't know what we were doing. So I definitely got all of my knowledge from like my advisors and my mentors. And so I think it's, important to provide that back. Now, again, it's because I'm also a grad student that works on lots of projects. So I always need lots of RAs. So it's going to be a little bit different than your professor who's a lecturer who doesn't do research and they're there to teach and that's it. They're not going to reach out for those opportunities to you. They're still going to be fantastic teachers, but they're not necessarily going to give you like those opportunities. But they, again, still may be a great letter of recommendation. So, sometimes it's the luck of the draw, the luck of your schedule.
Yeah. Specifically in the iLab, working with you, what are some experiences, technical skills that research assistants can expect to learn?
So I would say pretty much everybody does a lit review at some point, which you might say, I know how to do that. And then you get into a topic that you're like not really familiar with. You did research methods too, and you're like, I can Google that. And then you get into the research lab and you're like, oh, there's so many articles here. So I would say that's one skill that people generally get in my lab. Because one, it's really good for studies that we might start, or if there's like, hey, I really need more information on this subject. And so you assign a couple people and we do a little training and say, hey, this is how you should be doing lit reviews. So that's definitely a skill that I try to give all of my RAs at some point in their journey. And it's usually like in the beginning when people first start. Sometimes they come in at times when we have a lot to do, but sometimes they come in when we're a little bit slower and we're kind of working in the background. So definitely literature reviews. Another thing, because I'm an interviewing researcher, so most of the research that I do involves conducting interviews with participants, and so I can't do that all on my own. And so I do a lot of cognitive interview training, which is this kind of gold standard investigating interviewing protocol in the legal psychology world. And so that's just like a training that I usually give my RAs. So they will have at least some experience in what like actual police use for good, well-trained police forces will use for their witness interviews. And so just kind of getting the skills to interview people well and what it means to be a good interviewer. And then being able to like independently run protocols. I'd say pretty much any RA that I've had that has worked with, with a specific study, they will learn to run that study. And I'm not there all the time to like answer questions. So it's learning to be like independent, like you're going to run this session. You should not need me. And so we do lots of training by then. So again, doing that independently, troubleshooting, kind of running a participant from start to finish. Sometimes it's like complex protocols. Sometimes it's like, it sounds silly, but like acting, if you have like a specific persona you're supposed to bring on, sometimes we have those in research. So having some of that like fun experience that most people wouldn't necessarily think of getting. But also again, thinking about like that transcription work seems like it's pretty self-explanatory, but it is a skill to do that well. And so, a lot of people in my lab get that again as an interviewing researcher. We're doing lots of transcripts. But then again, coding experience, being able to categorize data. And that's, again, working with like very large teams often, getting training, following a very specific procedure and protocol, following a good training regimen. So I think that's most of the things. I've had a couple RAs that have went to like big conferences and presented their own research or had their own independent research projects. So I've had a couple of RAs do that. So yeah, it's kind of like a choose your own adventure. If you want to just do some, quick, easy work, great, I have that. If you're like, I have a lot I want to accomplish in my goals and, skills I want to obtain, great, I probably have that for you too. And so again, that's just my lab. But yeah, we also, I guess, fun things is like we have met like some of the Miami-Dade police people who are, hopefully benefiting from our research. So we've had some of that. We have like a lot of talks and like mentoring and internship stuff. We kind of share and disseminate. So just like other opportunities, it's almost like when you get one opportunity, you're open to like many more opportunities. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty awesome. I love that you described it as a choose your own adventure. So they kind of get to build with the building blocks you have.
Yeah.
And even the idea of like being able to like get an internship with, you know, the police force or something,
Yeah.
think through this lab, that's pretty awesome as well. And then I guess going back a little bit, right, to to research assistant interviews, can you tell us about an exceptional interview you've had? Like what really made that student stand out?
Ooh, I think some of the best interviews end up feeling more like conversations. So it's where you're like, which I guess is also true for research, you know, that's again, as an interviewing researcher, that's what I'm always hoping for, is that it becomes more of a conversation than a question and answer session. And so I think that's always nice when it's like somebody who is really, you know, you just get the impression of them immediately, of like who they are. They're very, very clear about this. These are my goals. This is what I want to do. This is how my plan is. So I think having those like really planned out, planned out people are really nice to have. But I don't think that's like a requirement either. Like I've definitely had some people who are like, I have no idea what I want to do, and I'm like, that's great. We can figure that out together. Because when I came to grad school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was like, I love this. I want to do research. I have no idea how I want to do it. And so it's okay to like refine those as you go on, because why would you know when you're like 19? Like that's unacceptable. And so, but it is always nice when people have some sort of understanding of like, you know, I understand your lab is research. I know kind of what that means. I know that this will help me for my future, which I'm hoping is something along this line. You know, having some sort of plan and like understanding how things fit in. I also usually look for people who are busier, is something that I notice, is like if I have RAs who, you know, they're going to school, they have a job, maybe they have another volunteer thing. Because I feel like those are the people, that's how I was an undergrad. And so I feel like those are the people who like know how to time manage really well, because they already have things that they're time managing. So they've already had that experience. So that always sticks out to me as well, of like, oh, you know what it means to be busy, and you've had that experience. And so again, not that I am promoting overwork by any means, but people that have had other things in their life that they have had to prioritize. That's always a nice little like check mark, like, oh, okay, I don't have to worry about like teaching you how to do that. You already have that understanding. So yeah, I think again, just going back to like when the interview feels more like a conversation, it's much more like fluid, and I can say, oh, you mentioned, great, tell me more about that. That was my next question. So those are always nice. And I mean, that's sometimes just luck and just the person. So, you know, and again, I've also had interviews of people who are more shy or more reserved, and those interviews still go really well too. It's not like a preference of one or the other, but it is just, you know, if you have some nice and chatty, it's a little bit easier to get that information. You kind of learn more about them. That doesn't mean that the quieter ones are any worse by any means.
Yeah, of course. And okay, I know you did say that you've basically taken everyone, you know, that you've interviewed. So I did want to know interview horror stories, but now I'm just gonna open up this question. So even if it's been like an interview you were on the receiving end of, do you have any interview horror stories you'd want to tell us about?
Ooh, I did have one in my undergrad. So I was also, in addition to like being a lab manager, I was kind of on the hiring, I don't know, a committee sounds a little too official, but we had interviews with potential RAs, and I was part of doing those. And we, I think just going, you know, there's a difference between being open about yourself and, you know, answering the questions that are being asked, and then going like too far. You know, and so I think going like a little too deep into your history or family or problems you're having, sometimes that's like a little much. Now, sometimes that might be relevant, especially for like more like, for example, if a lab is hiring for research assistants for a grant, they might have some other qualifications that they are looking for. And so it is a little bit more of an interview than, you know, hey, I'm doing my dissertation and I would like RAs to help me with that. So it's a little bit different. So it might be a little bit more of an interview process. So if you're getting paid, that's usually a little bit more of a, you know, that's obviously a finite resource that you have to pay people. So those are a little bit more interviewee than maybe the ones I typically conduct in my day to day. And so, you know, there's a balance between answering the question well and then just providing too much information. So I'd say definitely try to be personable, but you don't necessarily have to give like your whole like mental health history or your whole like problems that you're having with your partner or your parents or something like that. Like that's like beyond the scope. So I've had that happen before, which is always like, I know sometimes you just talk and you can't stop,
Oh,
and I've
God.
totally been in that position, but those are,
Yeah.
you don't want to say horror stories, but you kind of feel a little bit like, ooh, we need to pause this
Yeah.
conversation.
Right.
So do not word vomit. No overshare.
Yes,
But I'm
yes.
here.
I mean, word vomit is okay if you're nervous. Like, I totally get that. I'm a
There's a
word
time and a
vomiter for
place.
sure.
Yeah.
Yes, there's a time and a place.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, because that's not talking about the problems with your
The
partner.
relationship, that's crazy. That's crazy.
Like, I just got
Yeah.
dumped, actually.
I
That's
think
why I'm
I think they can use it for therapy.
Yes.
Like,
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, like sometimes you're like, I get it. I get those things affect our lives. And I love that you are an honest, we can always spend the positives. Love that you're honest and you feel
Yeah.
comfortable. Those are, great things to have, but not, again, time and place.
Yeah, of course. And I know what I've heard, to kind of prevent kind of going into uncharted waters is to do like a mock interview, right?
Mhm.
So that how you were saying for it to be more like a conversation, if you've
Mhm.
kind of practiced what you're gonna say, I would think like it'd be a little easier for those answers
Mhm.
to flow, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a balance between sounding like you're reading an essay and having a conversation. So I always think it's a little bit, my advice would be, again, depending on the kind of person you are, but just have the idea of what you want to say. Like there's some really generic questions. What do you want to do when you graduate? What is your current experience with legal psychology? Like if you're applying to like a clinical lab, they're probably going to ask you, do you have any clinical experience? Are you in, like, what is your experience working with kids? How do you work under pressure? Things like there's generally some ideas that are going to be pretty ubiquitous throughout any research assistant interview. And I'm sure there's, I don't know, a million things online that kind of tell you about those, even jobs that are kind of similar. How did you come to FIU? Why are you interested in this lab? Just so some of those like canned responses that are kind of like a necessity of the interviewing process sometimes. Just having those, again, I don't think rehearsed is necessarily the way to go, but having a general idea like, oh yeah, I want to enter this lab because I know I need it for grad school.
Yeah.
Sometimes that's enough of an answer. Sometimes it'll be, what is your most challenging academic situation you've had? When have you overcome a difficult challenge? Some of those, again, silly questions that tend to pop up in interviews. Having something in your mind, I don't think you need to go so far as like jotting down notes or anything, but just having a couple, think about it a little bit. Maybe just don't go in blind.
Yeah.
Have a little bit of an idea.
Okay, of course. I think that's honestly great advice, right? Have an idea of what you want to say, but still be natural about it. Don't be
Mhm.
rehearsed.
Yes. Because then if you're rehearsed all the time, but then you come up with a question that you did not rehearse for, then that's going to be super obvious. So you're like,
Yeah.
oh, I didn't write that one down. Can you give me a minute? Like that's worse.
You're like, let me hop on Google really quickly.
Right.
Let me just scroll through my like photos and see if I come up with anything. So it's definitely okay to say like, oh, like I'll even do that. I think I've done it here. Oh, great question. Let me think on that.
Yeah.
That's totally fine to say. Especially if it is some of those more like, when have you come up with a personal challenge? Like those are hard to come up with on the spot.
Right.
But if you're kind of pausing on things like, so what's your current major and why is it your major? And you're like, oh, I don't know. That's maybe a little bit more of a one that you don't want to just go with whatever comes out of your mouth. Have a little bit more of a plan than there.
Yeah. You should definitely know what your major is and
Yes.
at least a decent idea why.
Right.
Yes. Some semblance of why you went into this.
Yeah. Okay, I definitely love that advice. And now I want to kind of give you the platform to talk about your current research interests. We do know, you work with trying to improve eyewitness memory. And we also found out you are currently working on your dissertation. So we want to kind of give you the floor, talk about, I guess you did speak about like, how you kind of learned you love legal psych by joining that research lab, but maybe go into depth a little bit more with that or talk about maybe how, maybe how undergraduates right now might start to get a semblance of what they want to research. And also, tell us, I'm sorry, give me a second. Everybody freeze. My brain is like short-circuited. I'm so sorry.
Like at the very end, always hard to get
Yeah, like it's like I'm looking for where's the end of this question? Where's the question mark?
there.
Okay. So basically what I want to ask is just to kind of give an overview of the iLab, what it is that you do, for undergrads who are listening who might be interested in joining it, right? So just a little spiel about it, you know, and also tell us a bit about your dissertation. How's that?
So I think I pretty much got my best research ideas from reading research articles. That's probably where most of the ideas that I've had and the things that have come to fruition really started out. I was reading a research article and saying like, oh, that's really interesting. I wonder if they've done this. And you kind of go on Google Scholar and see if they've done it, and they haven't. You're like, great, I could do that research. So one of the projects that I'm probably like most proud of is I'm doing a interviewing study with sexual assault nurse examiners who are kind of the frontline workers when someone is sexually assaulted. And so they collect all the forensic evidence, they interview the victim about what occurred. And so I am currently in the process of working on this. We've gotten a couple grants to do it. So we're just trying to find out what their problems are in their field, changes they can make, training that can be helpful if they're really experiencing secondary trauma, and how we can potentially help with that. What help are they seeking? So it's a really huge, like multifaceted study, but it's one of the most interesting studies that I feel like I've ever done. And it's not for my master's or my dissertation. And so it's just like a side project that we've been working on. And I kind of came up with the idea for that study from reading a article in a wrongful convictions class about the rape kit backlog in Detroit, actually, not because I was from Michigan, but we read it in class of just like, hey, here's a thing that's happening that's relevant to wrongful convictions. And I kind of noticed there was this population of sane sexual assault nurse examiners, and it didn't really seem like there was tons of research about their general experience. And so that's what we're trying to hopefully accomplish there. So that's my one project that is like, it's always the nice when I have to work on it. It's like the nice, like, oh, I get to like do the thing that I really enjoy doing. And so I'm hoping to really take that research and continue. So still definitely relevant to like witnesses and interviewing in some context. But the other research I really enjoy is just like memory improvement kind of stuff. And so my dissertation is all about basically how we can change things in an interview and affect the information that participants will tell us in that interview. So in worry of going too in depth of my specific hypotheses, as I have not run the study, and that's bad research practices. That's the general idea, is that we're interviewing our participants and we're kind of giving them some different conditions that they will experience, and then see what happens to the information that they tell us, and see if we can predict what they will say. And so I had a very similar idea for my master's degree, my master's project that we did of just, and that was again where I said, sometimes you get acting experience. And so we had different kind of interviewing styles, a really aggressive interviewer, and then a really nice, fun interviewer. We wanted to see if that would impact the information that people would tell us, if they were basically a mean or a nice person. And unfortunately, we didn't find any effects, but that's normal and that happens. But yes, so that's kind of my general like research interest.
I know you said that right now you don't necessarily need as many like research assistants as you have in the past, but would you say that you guys are looking for research assistants for like upcoming summer and fall?
I know there are people in the legal program that are looking for research assistants, at least kind of maybe not right now, but like summer, fall time. So if you are somebody who wants to go to grad school for psychology in any way, shape, or form, legal psych research is there. We have lots of studies that we do. Some of them are in person, some of them are online, some of it's all remote work, some of it's in person. So there's a lot of different options and opportunities there. And we have a little Qualtrics application basically that you can submit if you're interested, that I'm sure they will provide the link for somewhere.
It'll be in the description, don't worry.
Sure.
Beautiful.
You will include that information.
Yes.
So then, yes, so you spoke about the research side of it. We kind of wanted to touch on another aspect of being a PhD student, which you had talked about before, how you taught a legal psychology class. I think it was wrongful convictions that you mentioned. And we kind of wanted to know, is it a requirement that when you are pursuing your PhD that you guys are expected to teach classes? Like, is that sort of a uniform thing or just an FIU specific policy?
I think it will likely depend on the program that you're in, but at FIU we aren't required to teach, and different programs, different universities will have different rules for that too. So at FIU, you have to have received your master's before you can teach, so you can't do it before that. But I also know other universities. I had a friend who the first semester she started her PhD program, she was teaching. So kind of depends on the school that you're at, and which would be terrifying, I think. But so
Yeah.
for us, we have the option to start teaching our own class after we get our master's degree. And so that's again, it's like voluntary. So it's either you teach or you're a TA, a teaching assistant. So you're like research methods 2 lab person, or the person that grades all your papers in your senior seminar class, or anything like that. Like that's our job. You can also be on a grant. And so if your PI has applied to, a big like NIJ, NIS, NIH grant, then you might be funded through that, which means that you do that work for that grant for your like full time of the week. So you dedicate the same amount of hours that you would typically dedicate to being a TA or teaching your own class to the grant. So it's an option. So there will be people in our program that go through their whole PhD and never have to teach. They only TA or they only run on a grant. I opted to teach because I was like, let me try it. I don't know if I'll like it. I'll try it. And then like I mentioned, I did it the first semester in, I think, summer of 22 and loved it. And then I've pretty much taught every semester since. So yeah, so I've taught legal psych, cognitive, and senior seminar. So we're going.
Right. Yeah. So it sounds like that they give you guys a choice to choose from. And then you did choose to teach. Have there been any unexpected lessons that you have noticed while working with undergraduate students, like something that you enjoyed about it that you didn't really expect to like?
So I've always known that I really liked like the mentoring aspect of like being a grad student and having RAs and things like that. But I didn't really expect it to come through as much as it does in like teaching. I really thought it would be just about like topics and then we kind of go. But it's really, a lot of students don't have somebody that they have like talked to about what they want to do. And I like to think I'm a generally approachable person. And I think as a graduate student too, it's a little maybe less stressful that I'm not called like Dr. Dawson as of yet. So maybe I'm a little bit more approachable in that way. And so I think I didn't necessarily expect as many, or as many questions about like, so grad school, like kind of like these conversations that we're having. I don't think I expected that as much, and that it's really beneficial for students to kind of have that. It's unfortunate when it happens in like senior seminar, which you usually take your last semester to here at FIU, and they don't know that they need research or that they don't have their personal statement updated or their personal statement's really bad. And you're like, ooh, we gotta work on this.
Right.
So it's always unfortunate when it happens a little bit later. So I do like teaching the courses that don't, I really like teaching senior seminar. I think it's really fun, but I also like teaching the courses for the mentoring aspects that are a little bit earlier in the sequence. Things like legal, where you can, I think, take with like a minimum prerequisite, and cognitive, which also has like pretty minimal prereqs. So those are kind of nice where it's like, oh, you can start thinking about this now. And you don't have to like freak out in your senior year last semester. You can be a sophomore or junior and say, oh, I'm going to dedicate the next year to being a really good applicant for a PhD program. So that's kind of expected that I always kind of knew in the back of my mind, but it was nice to just be like a resource for people. So I've even had students reach out, a year after the class and be like, hey, I had you for senior seminar. Can you help me with my personal statement? Can we talk about grad school? And I'm like, yeah, let's do that. So that's been nice.
Yeah, and I think that's so awesome that you're willing to give your time and your help like that. I think that's something great. And then when you do choose to teach, do they kind of give you like the course structure, or are you kind of free to determine what you teach, or are they like, okay, no, we need you for psychotherapy at this time, and like that's something that it's like, do they give you options?
So actually it's pretty, at least for again, I think it's very different depending on where you go, but at least for us, it's pretty flexible. So I pretty much get to choose when I teach, generally, in the sense of like, if I want a Tuesday, Thursday class, a Monday, Wednesday class, I personally like having 1 day a week class. We meet for 3 hours and we have lunch in the middle. Those are my preference. If anyone has taken my classes before, that's generally my preference. And so I get a little bit of flexibility there. And what they typically will ask is, if you're interested in teaching, what classes would you be willing to teach? And so the first semester I ever taught, I said I would be interested in teaching legal psych because I'd already TA'd for it before. So I kind of had an understanding of what the class entailed from like a different professor. Um, kind of. But then we as primary instructors get to do whatever we want. So I can teach however I want, whatever I want. I can make up whatever assignments. I can choose whatever book I want. I can choose if I don't want a book and we just read articles. That's what we do in my senior seminar class. So it's all up to me. I get to choose absolutely everything. So the first time is always really scary because you're like, I don't know what I'm doing. And of course you don't. But then you learn that no one else knows what they're doing either. They just have been doing it in this way for so long. So I always try to like improve after I've taught a class once. And if I teach it again, I'm like, okay, I can improve that. But then sometimes they will say, I'll say, hey, I'm interested in teaching legal. And they might say, hey, we actually have an opening for cognitive. That's how I taught cognitive this past, like last summer. Because they said, we really need someone to teach this. Would you be willing to? So I could have said, no, I would like to teach legal. And they probably would have let me. But I was like, you know what? Yeah, why not? I'll add another one. And so that one was a little bit more structured just because I was like, I don't even know where to begin for that. Like I learned cognitive things in my, in my degree program, but it's not my main shtick. And so I asked a couple other graduate students that since graduated, like, hey, can I have your materials? Kind of just based it off of that. But I could have chose whatever I want. And then I'm teaching research methods this next summer. And that's only because I TA'd for it last semester. And so they said, hey, we saw that you TA'd for research methods too. Do you want to teach it? I'm like, you know what? Sure. Why not? And that one's a little bit different because it's standardized. So you might have heard your professors, if you've taken research methods, that's a standardized course. So no matter what research methods you take, it's the exact same. So that should technically be easier than creating your own course, which is sometimes true and sometimes not. So so FIU is really nice because they are super flexible for you as like a primary instructor. We're essentially like treated in that way as adjuncts. So we can put a request in, hey, I want to be at this day, this time, this location, if possible, and they try to accommodate us as well as they can. So that's really nice.
Yeah, I think it's super cool that they give you that flexibility to kind of mold the classroom to, your goals and what the messages that you want to carry across. And I'm sure that working with the undergrads, I'm sure parts of it were great. I would love to hear about the parts that weren't so great, maybe like the grading was a little bit tedious, or maybe some not so great experiences that you had that you would like to elaborate on.
Yeah, grading is always going to be tedious. So for anyone that's taken research methods too, grading those 5 essays is the worst experience ever. It's terrible, but I do generally like grading and providing feedback. I always wish I could do it like a smaller scale. And this semester, I actually have a really small class. I only have 15 students in my class, and I find myself making so many more comments because I just have the time to. So I really like that part of grading. Hopefully all the students read their feedback and they see the feedback that I'm providing. So I wish I could do that for classes of 50, 60 students, but that's just unfortunately not possible. So I'm trying to think of like horror stories. I don't really have anything that terrible. That generally students are pretty good. I've had some really great discussions in my class. I always love when we, go on a related tangent to the class where people just bring up ideas and then it becomes a discussion amongst the students and I'm not really in it. That's always kind of nice because it always ends up being relevant. It seems like it wouldn't. It's like, oh, everyone's gotten off topic, but they're learning to, connect something from their outside life to what's happening in class. And I think that's always really awesome to see and just like kind of sit back and be like, oh, I just get to experience what the students are doing. So that's always nice when that happens. And as someone with the seminar class, we talk every class. So we have lots of discussions. So there's lots of opportunity for that to happen. And that's always nice. But I don't really have any like huge horror stories, except that I feel like I always get stuck in the classroom that's really hot. That's the only thing I think. Because every time I'm like, man, can't I get one of the cold rooms in PC or something? Instead, I'm just like always hot. That's probably the worst part.
Understandable. I love that you choose to focus on the bright side. That's great.
I'm an optimist at heart.
Right. I love that. Well, thank you so much for coming on. Those were all of our questions. And before we wrap up, we kind of had a segment that we want to try with our guests. We got to meet Haley Dawson, the PhD student, but we would love to get to know Haley Dawson, the person. Wanted to hear how you've been able to make space for fun and maintain your social and personal life as the professional demands seem to increase. Like, how have you found that you can deal with that and still sort of stay sane in this whole process?
That's such a good question. I think there is almost like a split of graduate students. So I started grad school. I was in grad school for 1 semester and 3 months, and then the pandemic happened. So I was essentially a pandemic grad student, and that was such a different experience. Like, we always hear about grad student burnout and, overworking and working super long hour days, working every day of the week. And that was definitely true, particularly during the pandemic. So I was, I think, both mostly fortunate that I was able to do a really big research project throughout the pandemic on contact tracing interviewing, which is what people were doing for, exposure to COVID. And so I was like funded through that grant, which means I was doing that research all of the time during the pandemic. And so I think in that kind of early stages when you're hoping to learn what work-life balance looks like, we didn't really get that opportunity. I was working with another grad student because we were just working all of the time. And I think a lot of people experience that because we were at home. What else are you gonna do? I've already done my, 4 options I have in my 1-bedroom apartment. And so I guess I'm just gonna keep working. And so I think that time to really develop that like good work-life balance was almost like taken from us, because what else did you have to do but work? And so then when things got back to in person, there was still a little bit of that mentality. So I think it's easier as you go through grad school, where you learn to like set those boundaries. I try not to work Saturdays. My partner and I try to set those aside, and that's like us days, whether we do a date night, or we just stay in and watch a movie, or we go out to dinner, and that's like our day to do not work, and we're not going to feel bad about it. Maybe we'll play a video game all day. Who knows? So we have done that in the last like year or so. That has been really nice, because it's always easy to feel really guilty about the things that you are not doing. And I think as a grad student, and I think this is true for undergrads as well, particularly if you're doing like research projects, essentially there's like always going to be more things you can do. There's always going to be another seminar you can go to, another webinar, and another, I don't know, a LinkedIn badge that you can get. There's always going to be something more you can do, and you're just never going to get there, and that's okay. There's a million other things you can do, and it's important to just take a breather sometimes. You're always going to be better for it if you take a pause. And so I've more so in my like later years as a PhD student have tried to kind of limit those. So no Saturdays, Sundays, like minimal, unless I have a deadline I really got to get to. I try not to work too late into the evenings. I know a lot of friends are like 6 o'clock, I'm done. I work, I get up, work all day, 6 o'clock happens and I'm done, or 7, because even as grad students, we have lots of other projects that we're doing. So it's not always realistic to only work 40 hours, but it's kind of, segmenting that time as you can. So I think just kind of really setting, like putting it in your calendar of like, this is free time. And I'm not going to feel guilty about that free time, and just really honoring that. So that's, I would say, generally how I have approached balance. No balance for a very long time, and trying to have balance now. And I've never been someone with like a 9-to-5 job. I've always had like 500 things I'm doing. I worked full-time in undergrad, went to school full-time, was doing research stuff. So I never like had, oh, I just am doing this one thing. So I think that lended itself well to grad school, because that's very similar to how grad school feels. But yeah, I think that answered the question.
Yeah, like 1,000%. And I appreciate you meeting us, because I know that it was pretty late in the evening. So sorry, but I really appreciate it.
No, you're good.
And yeah,
it wasn't like a 10 p.m. situation.
Right, no, that's a little excessive, but no, no, and I really did want to point out that guilt is real, 100%. It always feels like the to-do list is never ending, and there's always something to be done. And then you start off like your day saying, I have these 10 things to do, and maybe you did too, and it's learning to have the grace with yourself to be like, okay, 2 is all that I could do today, and like that's good for today. I did what I could.
And it's so hard sometimes too, because like I always think of myself as a person that's really like more alert and more active at night, and so sometimes it's like I give myself the grace to sleep in because I stayed up till 2 a.m. because that was when I was inspired to do my work, you know?
Yeah.
So sometimes it goes the other way around too. Where it's like, I'm not going to feel bad for sleeping until 10 a.m. Actually, I'm going to be fine with it. And that I didn't start my day till noon because the night before was a late night. And that has to be okay. So I think it's just fine. You know, I love that you said giving yourself the grace because I say that all the time. It's like, you got to give yourself the grace to just be, and it's okay. You know, I think we talk about the Sunday scaries a lot, where it's like, oh God, the week is starting. But it's usually because we feel like that guilt. And I think just being able to say, like, actually, today is not going to be a work day, and I refuse to let myself feel guilty about it because I've already set this aside as a free day, and there's no work happening, and I cannot feel guilty about it.
Right.
But
And
that's
I feel
hard.
like,
It's hard.
yeah. And I feel like this is even tied to a conversation in boundaries. Like I think you mentioned it earlier. It's
Mhm.
learning when to say no
Mhm.
to yourself, but also I think externally, because I think this like academic culture almost encourages you to be constantly working and constantly striving, that
Yeah.
it's learning how to have boundaries. And it's like no one teaches you those things.
Mhm.
So, you know, it's
No.
yeah.
And we always talk about, you know, you need to take all the opportunities that come to you, or you like try to maximize those, but sometimes we can't do all of them, and it's always great to say, like, yeah, I want to do the next thing. You know, it's, and that's kind of like I mentioned, like when I interview RAs and they already have lots of things on their plate, like I'm almost never concerned about those people that I'm like, well, can you add this to your plate? I usually ask them, like, well, how do you plan to incorporate your 9 hours a week into your you know, into your time management? But I'm never really worried about it because they always will find time. So I think it's also being realistic that we do waste a lot of time in the world. So I have limits on my phone for like social media. Do I hit that remind me later a few times a day?
Of course.
Sometimes I do. But
Right.
it's also like I am better served if I'm not just scrolling mindlessly or like doom scrolling. But I'm always better off when I have, you know, I get that nice notification at the end of the week that's like, your screen time is down from last week. I'm like, yes,
I love
it
Yeah.
that.
should be. Because there's other things that I should be doing.
Right.
Exactly.
So it's kind of nice to, you know, set boundaries within yourself, like you said, because man, do we waste a lot of time sometimes.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of things out there that the goal is to just get our attention. This is something a little random. I don't even remember where I heard this, but it was the idea that like in the past, people focus on like colonizing land, right? And expanding, taking land. But now the idea is to colonize people's attention because we've already kind of gone through the whole world and settled everywhere we would settle. And now the idea is like, how much of people's attention can you take? Like
Yeah.
social media is built to basically be addictive, to give you that dopamine rush. And I love that you bring that up because it's not just the idea of like, yes, giving yourself space to rest, but also maximizing your time in a way where, you know, you're not just wasting it. Because when you're on social media, you're often not really resting, right? You're still
No.
using energy, you know, but now you're like more tired because you worked. Maybe you spent like a little bit longer on Instagram or TikTok than you should have. And
Yes.
now you still need rest time. But if some of that doom scrolling turned into rest time, then maybe burnout like wouldn't impact people as much.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's always a time and place for social media. Like I don't think it's the big bad guy that, you know, it's often made out to be. Like there are a lot of positives that can come from social media. Like the ability to just like mobilize you know, people into like doing good is really nice. You know, like petitions for good things get signed really quickly now that would take years to do in the past. So I think there's definitely benefits, but like you said, sometimes it doesn't serve you to just like scroll through where I'm like, hey, I'm reading a book right now that I really love. Maybe I could spend 30 minutes doing that and I'd be in a better headspace, you know, unless they left me on a cliffhanger, I guess, but I would just read more.
Yeah.
So there's, you know, or I would be, you know, better off if I went and made a recipe that I've really been interested in. And so I think there's always just trying to move that time into something that just serves you better. Because I like never feel better after social media usually, but I am pretty happy when I have a nice like cupcake to eat.
Yeah, maybe if you know you hopped on the what is it, the chef social media where they teach you
Yeah.
to make a cupcake.
Yes.
Yeah.
Like something that great.
Yeah, so kind of like being more maybe meaningful and intentional with the way we use social media to make it a positive experience instead of like something draining. But I do also want to ask you in that same thread, what is your like, I guess, best advice for undergraduates who are looking to also be more intentional with both their time that they spend working or on social media or and also on self-care?
Gosh, that's such a good question. And I think something that I don't think anyone has mastered. I would love to talk to that person that's like, I have perfect everything I don't think they exist. But I think it's just being like honest with yourself of like, what are you spending time doing, you know, and is it something that you enjoy? So, you know, like we kind of talked about like social media, if you're you know, you're checking, you know, oh, I'm going to start tracking on my phone, you know, how much time I spend. If you're realizing like TikTok takes up 2 hours of your day, suddenly you only have 22 hours in the day, and that's going to come from somewhere. So not that we all have the same 24 hours. Sometimes you have other obligations that take you there, but it's prioritizing, right? And so if you know, this internship that I have is going to be really important, and so I need to dedicate that time, even if I really don't have the space. Sometimes you do just got to push through. Not every day or every, you know, chunk of time in your life is going to be beautiful, sunshine, rainbows, perfectly balanced. Would love for that to happen. That's just not realistic. So we have a lot of things to do. Maybe you have a family thing come up and you, you know, really have to spend some mental energy on that. You can't just stop the other things that you, you know, have already agreed to and committed yourself to. So sometimes there's going to be times when your cup is overflowing a little more than you would like. But the goal is always to then give yourself that break after. You know, you can't have that cup overflowing forever. And so I think it's just really assessing like where that time is going and being just honest with yourself. So you might say like, oh, I don't really spend that much time on social media, but then you look and you're like, okay, 5 hours I have spent on just scrolling apps this day. That's not great. And you know, thinking about how you could spend that time differently. And maybe it is just, hey, I'm actually going to take a longer shower and I'm going to really just spend that time with myself because there's no social media, there's nothing, it's just me and my thoughts. You know, and maybe that is more time well spent doing something maybe a little silly, but it is a place where you can be like, there's no electronics in here unless you're a little crazy. Maybe maybe you have something. I wouldn't recommend it.
Water,
but yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. But yeah, just trying to see like where you can kind of move that time a little bit, or maybe you aren't really, you know, spending a lot of quality time with your partner, and you say, hey, we're gonna like segment out that time because we aren't going to do it if we don't. We can always say like, oh, we're going to plan to do that. We got to plan to do it. Put it on the calendar. That's what you need to do, because then it'll be more likely to happen. And making that like commitment to your own personal time. So you can, again, always give yourself up to everybody forever.
Much for coming on, Haley. Do you have any last words for our viewers?
Well, I'll get through this eventually. We'll all make it to where we're supposed to be.
I love that. Yeah, that resonated. That definitely resonated. So thank you everyone for listening in today with Passing into the Future. As usual, I'm your host, Io.
I'm Nyla.
And of course, we were here with Haley. Bye everyone and see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.